In the autumn of 1858, a traveling minister named Reverend Samuel Morrison arrived at the Whitaker Inn, a remote establishment nestled deep in the Cumberland Mountains of Tennessee. What he discovered there would haunt him for the remainder of his days and reveal a truth so horrifying that it would be buried in official records, spoken of only in whispers among those brave enough to venture into the darkest corners of American history. The Whitaker Inn had operated for nearly 3 decades, serving travelers who dared to cross the treacherous mountain passes between Tennessee and Kentucky. Built in 1830 by Josiah Whitaker and his extended family, the inn had gained a reputation as a welcome refuge for weary travelers, seeking shelter from the harsh mountain weather and the dangers that lurked in the wilderness. Reverend Morrison had been traveling through the region as part of his missionary work, bringing the Word of God to remote communities that rarely saw outsiders. His journey had taken him far from the established roads and settlements, following ancient trails that wound through valleys where civilization seemed to have barely touched the land. The October evening was growing cold and dark when he first glimpsed the warm lights of the Whitaker Inn, glowing through the mist that clung to the mountainside. The inn appeared to be a substantial structure built of local stone and timber in the style common to the region. Smoke rose from multiple chimneys, suggesting warmth and comfort within, and the windows glowed with the inviting light of oil lamps and firelight. To a traveler who had spent days navigating treacherous mountain paths, the sight was more welcome than any cathedral. Josiah Whitaker himself greeted Reverend Morrison at the door, a tall, gaunt man with piercing eyes and a manner that seemed both welcoming and somehow unsettling. He spoke with the slow, measured cadence common to mountain folk, but there was something in his voice that suggested depths and secrets that a casual visitor would never suspect. The other members of the Whitaker family who appeared to assist with Morrison's arrival shared similar characteristics, their faces bearing the unmistakable signs of close kinship and their movements displaying a coordination that suggested they functioned as a single unit. The interior of the inn was rustic but comfortable, with heavy wooden furniture and decorations that reflected the mountain culture of the region. The main room featured a large stone fireplace, around which several other guests had gathered, their conversations creating a warm buzz of human activity that seemed to dispel the isolation and eeriness of the mountain setting. Morrison was pleased to see that he would not be the only guest that evening, as the presence of other travelers always made for more interesting conversation and a greater sense of security. As Morrison settled into the common room and began to converse with his fellow guests, he was struck by the diverse group that had gathered at the inn. There was a merchant from Louisville who was traveling to markets in the Carolinas, a young couple who claimed to be heading west to seek their fortune in the territories, and an elderly man who said he was a scholar researching the history and folklore of the mountain regions. Each had their own story to tell, and the evening passed pleasantly as they shared tales of their travels and experiences. The Whitaker family served an excellent dinner, featuring game from the local forests and vegetables from their own gardens. The meal was prepared with skill and attention to detail that surprised Morrison, who had not expected such culinary sophistication in such a remote location. The wine that accompanied the meal was particularly noteworthy, with a rich, complex flavor that seemed to improve as the evening progressed, creating a sense of warmth and conviviality among the guests. As the night wore on, Morrison began to notice subtle details about the inn and its inhabitants that troubled him in ways he couldn't quite articulate. The Whitaker family members moved through the building with a silence and efficiency that seemed almost supernatural, appearing and disappearing without making a sound. Their conversations with guests were friendly and accommodating, but there was something in their manner that suggested they were observing and evaluating rather than simply providing hospitality. The decorations throughout the inn, while appearing rustic and appropriate to the setting, contained elements that seemed oddly out of place. There were symbols carved into wooden beams and painted on walls that Morrison didn't recognize, designs that seemed to follow patterns too deliberate and complex to be merely decorative. The paintings that adorned the walls depicted mountain scenes and local wildlife, but the expressions on the faces of both human and animal subjects suggested something darker than the peaceful rural life they were meant to represent. Morrison's room was located on the second floor of the inn, with a window that looked out over the valley below. As he prepared for sleep, he became aware of sounds coming from other parts of the building that seemed inconsistent with the normal activities of an inn. There were footsteps in corridors where no guests should have been walking, voices engaged in whispered conversations in languages he didn't recognize, and strange rhythmic sounds that seemed to emanate from somewhere deep within the structure. Sleep came fitfully to Morrison that night, interrupted by dreams that seemed too vivid and disturbing to be products of his own imagination. He dreamed of ancient rituals conducted in mountain clearings, of figures moving through the forest carrying torches and engaging in activities that his conscious mind refused to accept. The dreams were accompanied by sounds that seemed to come from within the inn itself, as if the building were alive and breathing around him. When morning arrived, Morrison awoke feeling exhausted and disoriented, as if he had not slept at all. The other guests appeared at breakfast in similar condition, their faces pale and their manner subdued. The cheerful conversations of the previous evening had been replaced by a tense silence broken only by polite requests for food and drink. The Whitaker family served the meal with the same efficiency they had displayed the night before, but Morrison noticed that they seemed more animated and energetic than their guests, as if they had drawn strength from some source that remained hidden from outsiders. During breakfast, Morrison attempted to engage his fellow guests in conversation, hoping to dispel the strange atmosphere that had settled over the inn. The merchant from Louisville seemed particularly troubled, mentioning that he had experienced disturbing dreams and had heard unusual sounds throughout the night. The young couple appeared nervous and eager to continue their journey, while the elderly scholar seemed lost in thought, as if he were trying to solve a puzzle that remained just beyond his comprehension. As the morning progressed, Morrison began to notice that the number of guests at the inn seemed to be diminishing. The merchant from Louisville had apparently left very early before dawn, according to Josiah Whitaker, who explained that the man had been eager to reach his destination and had not wanted to delay his journey. The young couple had also departed, again without taking the time to say farewell to their fellow guests, which struck Morrison as unusual given their friendly manner the previous evening. By midday, only Morrison and the elderly scholar remained at the inn, along with a new arrival who had appeared during the morning hours. The newcomer was a traveling salesman who claimed to be carrying goods to remote settlements in the mountains, his wagon loaded with supplies and merchandise that would be valuable to isolated communities. He seemed unaware of the strange atmosphere that had settled over the inn, chatting cheerfully with the Whitaker family and expressing his appreciation for their hospitality. Morrison found himself increasingly uncomfortable with the situation at the inn, though he couldn't identify any specific reason for his unease. The Whitaker family continued to be accommodating and friendly, the food and lodging were excellent, and there was nothing overtly threatening about the environment. Yet something in his instincts warned him that he was in danger, that the inn harbored secrets that would be better left undiscovered. The elderly scholar approached Morrison during the afternoon, introducing himself as Professor Elias Blackwood, a researcher from the University of Virginia, who was studying the folklore and customs of the Appalachian region. Professor Blackwood had been traveling through the mountains for several months, collecting stories and documenting traditions that were in danger of being lost as the region became more connected to the outside world. Professor Blackwood's manner was serious and scholarly, but Morrison detected an undercurrent of concern in his voice as he spoke about his research. The professor had encountered stories and legends throughout the mountains that suggested the existence of communities and practices that existed outside the bounds of normal society. He spoke of isolated families and clans that had maintained traditions dating back to the earliest European settlements, customs that had evolved in ways that would be considered disturbing by mainstream society. According to Professor Blackwood, the mountain regions of Tennessee and Kentucky harbored communities that had been cut off from outside influence for generations, developing their own unique cultures and belief systems. Some of these communities had allegedly preserved practices that dated back to pre-Christian traditions, rituals and customs that had been brought to America by early settlers and had evolved in isolation into forms that bore little resemblance to their original sources. The professor's research had led him to investigate reports of families and communities that engaged in practices that mainstream society would consider abhorrent. He had collected accounts of rituals involving human sacrifice, communities that practiced forms of cannibalism, and isolated groups that worshipped entities and forces that existed outside normal religious understanding. While most of these accounts could be dismissed as folklore and superstition, Professor Blackwood had found enough corroborating evidence to suggest that some of them might be based on reality. As Professor Blackwood shared his research with Morrison, the Reverend began to understand the source of his unease about the Whitaker Inn. The professor's descriptions of isolated mountain communities that had preserved ancient and forbidden practices seemed to match the strange atmosphere and subtle details that Morrison had observed since his arrival. The symbols carved into the wooden beams, the unusual coordination among the Whitaker family members, and the mysterious disappearance of guests all took on new and sinister significance. Morrison and Professor Blackwood spent the afternoon discussing their observations and concerns about the inn, comparing notes and trying to piece together a picture of what might be happening around them. The professor had noticed many of the same details that had troubled Morrison, and he had additional observations based on his extensive research into mountain folklore and customs. According to Professor Blackwood, the Whitaker Inn matched descriptions he had encountered in several accounts of establishments that served purposes beyond simple hospitality. These places allegedly functioned as centers for communities that practiced ancient rituals and customs, providing a way to identify and select individuals who could serve the community's needs. The inn's remote location and the transient nature of its guests would make it an ideal place for such activities to take place without detection. The professor's research had revealed that some mountain communities had developed elaborate systems for identifying suitable candidates for their rituals, using various criteria to evaluate potential victims. Travelers who were alone, who had no strong connections to the outside world, or who possessed specific physical or psychological characteristics might be selected for purposes that the communities considered sacred, but that mainstream society would view as criminal. Professor Blackwood had also discovered evidence that these communities maintained detailed records of their activities, documenting their rituals and ceremonies in journals and ledgers that were passed down through generations. These records allegedly contained information about the selection and preparation of victims, the specific procedures followed during ceremonies, and the beliefs and traditions that guided the community's practices. The professor shared with Morrison some of the more disturbing details he had uncovered during his research, including accounts of communities that had developed sophisticated methods for preserving and preparing human remains for use in their rituals. These practices allegedly involved techniques that had been refined over generations, creating procedures that were both efficient and reverent according to the community's belief systems. Morrison was horrified by these revelations, but he was also fascinated by the scholarly thoroughness with which Professor Blackwood had approached his research. The professor had maintained detailed notes and documentation of his findings, creating a comprehensive record of the communities and practices he had studied. This methodical approach had allowed him to identify patterns and connections that might have been missed by less systematic investigators. Professor Blackwood's research had also revealed disturbing information about the historical origins of these mountain communities and their practices. According to his findings, many of these groups were descendants of European settlers who had brought ancient pagan traditions with them to America, traditions that had been suppressed and driven underground in their homelands by the spread of Christianity and the authority of established churches. The isolation of the Appalachian Mountains had provided these communities with the perfect environment to preserve and develop their ancestral practices without interference from outside authorities. Over generations of isolation, these traditions had evolved and adapted to local conditions, incorporating elements from Native American cultures and developing unique characteristics that reflected the harsh realities of mountain life. The professor had discovered evidence that these communities viewed themselves as the guardians of ancient wisdom and sacred knowledge that had been lost to the outside world. They believed that their practices connected them to fundamental forces and entities that controlled the natural world, and that their rituals were necessary to maintain the balance between the human and supernatural realms. According to Professor Blackwood's research, the communities that practiced these ancient rituals operated according to complex systems of belief and tradition that governed every aspect of their lives. They had developed elaborate hierarchies and leadership structures that determined who could participate in different types of ceremonies, and they maintained strict codes of secrecy that protected their activities from discovery by outsiders. The professor had also uncovered evidence that these communities maintained contact with similar groups in other parts of the country and possibly even in other countries, sharing information and resources through networks of communication that had been established over many generations. This suggested that what Morrison and Professor Blackwood had encountered at the Whitaker Inn was not an isolated phenomenon, but part of a much larger and more organized movement. As evening approached, Morrison and Professor Blackwood found themselves in an increasingly precarious situation. They were isolated in a remote location, surrounded by people whose true intentions remained unknown, and they had no way to communicate with the outside world or summon help if their suspicions proved correct. The arrival of the traveling salesman had provided some comfort, as his presence meant they were not entirely alone, but it also raised the possibility that he too might be in danger. The dinner served that evening was even more elaborate than the previous night's meal, featuring dishes that seemed to have been prepared with special care and attention. The Whitaker family was more attentive than usual, ensuring that their guests' wine glasses were never empty and encouraging them to sample every course. The atmosphere was festive and welcoming, but Morrison and Professor Blackwood found it difficult to enjoy the meal given their growing suspicions about their host's true intentions. The traveling salesman seemed oblivious to the tension that Morrison and Professor Blackwood were experiencing, chatting enthusiastically about his business and his travels throughout the region. He praised the Whitaker family's hospitality and expressed his intention to recommend the inn to other travelers he might encounter in his journeys. His innocent enthusiasm served to highlight the contrast between his perception of the situation and the darker reality that Morrison and Professor Blackwood suspected lay beneath the surface. As the evening progressed, Morrison noticed that the wine being served had a more pronounced effect than usual, creating a sense of drowsiness and disorientation that made it difficult to maintain clear thoughts. Professor Blackwood seemed to be experiencing similar effects, his scholarly precision giving way to a vague confusion that made coherent conversation increasingly difficult. The traveling salesman appeared to be the most affected, his cheerful chatter gradually fading into mumbled responses and glazed expressions. Morrison realized that their drinks had been drugged, and he attempted to warn Professor Blackwood and the traveling salesman about the danger they were facing. However, his own mental faculties were becoming increasingly impaired, and his warnings came out as slurred and incoherent statements that his companions were unable to understand. The Whitaker family continued to serve and attend to their guests with the same friendly efficiency they had displayed throughout their stay. But Morrison could now see the calculating intelligence behind their smiles. As consciousness began to fade, Morrison caught glimpses of the Whitaker family members moving through the room with purpose and coordination that confirmed his worst fears. They were preparing for something, arranging objects and making preparations that suggested the evening's activities were far from over. The last thing Morrison remembered before losing consciousness was the sight of Josiah Whitaker standing over him with an expression that revealed the true nature of the man behind the facade of mountain hospitality. Morrison awoke in darkness, his head pounding and his mouth dry from the effects of whatever substance had been used to drug him. He found himself in what appeared to be a cellar or basement beneath the inn, lying on a stone floor that was cold and damp. The air was thick with the smell of earth and something else that he couldn't identify, but that filled him with a sense of dread and revulsion. As his eyes adjusted to the darkness, Morrison could make out the shapes of other figures lying nearby. Professor Blackwood was unconscious but breathing, while the traveling salesman remained motionless in a way that suggested he might not have survived whatever had been done to him. The cellar was larger than Morrison had expected, with stone walls that seemed to have been carved directly from the mountain rock and passages that led away into deeper darkness. The walls of the cellar were decorated with symbols and carvings that were similar to those Morrison had noticed throughout the inn, but here they were more elaborate and disturbing. The design seemed to tell a story or convey a message that Morrison couldn't decipher, but their presence suggested that this place had been used for ceremonial purposes for a very long time. The stone floor showed signs of wear that indicated regular use, and there were stains and marks that Morrison preferred not to examine too closely. Morrison attempted to wake Professor Blackwood, hoping that together they might be able to find a way to escape from their prison. The professor stirred slowly, his scholarly mind struggling to process their situation and understand how they had come to be in such dire circumstances. When he finally regained full consciousness, his reaction was one of horror and disbelief as he realized that his research into mountain folklore had led him directly into the hands of one of the communities he had been studying. The sound of footsteps and voices from above indicated that the Whitaker family was active in the inn, presumably preparing for whatever ritual or ceremony they had planned. Morrison and Professor Blackwood could hear the movement of furniture and the lighting of fires, suggesting that elaborate preparations were underway. The sounds were accompanied by chanting or singing in a language that neither man recognized, melodies that were both beautiful and deeply unsettling. Professor Blackwood's knowledge of mountain folklore and customs provided some insight into what they might be facing, though the reality of their situation was far worse than anything he had encountered in his academic research. According to the accounts he had collected, some mountain communities practiced rituals that involved the sacrifice of outsiders to entities or forces that they believed controlled their fate and prosperity. These ceremonies were allegedly conducted according to ancient traditions that had been passed down through generations, evolving and adapting to local conditions while maintaining their essential character. The rituals that Professor Blackwood had studied were said to serve multiple purposes within the communities that practiced them. They were believed to ensure good fortune and prosperity for the community, to maintain the favor of supernatural forces, and to strengthen the bonds between community members through shared participation in sacred activities. The selection of victims was allegedly based on specific criteria that varied between communities, but travelers and outsiders were often preferred because their disappearance would be less likely to attract attention from authorities. As Morrison and Professor Blackwood discussed their situation and tried to develop a plan for escape, they became aware that they were not alone in the cellar. There were other chambers and passages that contained evidence of previous victims, remains and belongings that suggested the Whitaker Inn had been serving its true purpose for many years. The scope of what they had discovered was staggering, indicating that dozens or possibly hundreds of travelers had met their fate in this remote mountain location. The evidence that Morrison and Professor Blackwood found in the cellar painted a picture of a systematic operation that had been conducted with careful planning and organization. The Whitaker family had apparently been using their inn to identify and capture suitable victims for their rituals, taking advantage of the remote location and the transient nature of their guests to avoid detection by authorities. The operation had been refined over years of practice, with procedures and methods that ensured maximum efficiency and minimum risk of exposure. The cellar contained chambers that had been specifically designed for holding prisoners, with heavy doors and secure locks that would prevent escape. There were also areas that appeared to have been used for preparation and storage, containing tools and implements whose purpose Morrison preferred not to contemplate. The entire facility had been constructed with the same attention to detail and craftsmanship that characterized the inn above, suggesting that it had been planned and built as an integral part of the operation. Morrison and Professor Blackwood realized that their chances of escape were limited, as the cellar had been designed to prevent exactly such attempts. The doors were solid and secure, the walls were carved from solid rock, and there appeared to be no windows or other openings that might provide an alternative exit. Their only hope lay in finding a way to overcome their captors when they next appeared, though the Whitaker family's experience and preparation made this a daunting prospect. The sounds from above grew more intense as the evening progressed, with the chanting and singing becoming more elaborate and the movement of people becoming more coordinated. Morrison could hear what sounded like a large gathering of people, suggesting that the Whitaker family had been joined by others from the surrounding community. The ritual that was being prepared was apparently a significant event that involved more than just the immediate family members who operated the inn. Professor Blackwood's research had indicated that mountain communities often came together for important ceremonies, with families and clans traveling considerable distances to participate in rituals that were central to their cultural and religious practices. The gathering that was taking place above them suggested that Morrison and Professor Blackwood had arrived at the inn during a particularly significant time in the community's calendar, when a major ceremony was scheduled to take place. The realization that they were facing not just the Whitaker family, but an entire community of people who shared similar beliefs and practices, made their situation even more desperate. Even if they managed to escape from the cellar, they would still be surrounded by hostile territory, where every person they encountered might be part of the same network of communities that practiced these ancient rituals. As the night wore on, Morrison and Professor Blackwood could hear the ritual above them reaching its climax, with the chanting and singing becoming more intense and the movement of people becoming more frenzied. The sounds that filtered down to the cellar were unlike anything either man had ever experienced, combining human voices with other sounds that seemed to come from sources that defied rational explanation. The ceremony above seemed to continue for hours, with periods of intense activity, alternating with moments of relative quiet. Morrison and Professor Blackwood used these quieter periods to continue their search for a means of escape, exploring every corner of their prison and testing every possible weakness in their confinement. Their efforts were hampered by the darkness and their weakened condition, but they persisted in their attempts to find a way out. During one of their explorations, Professor Blackwood discovered a passage that led deeper into the mountain, apparently connecting the cellar beneath the inn to a network of natural caves that extended far underground. The passage was narrow and treacherous, but it offered the possibility of escape if they could navigate it successfully. The professor's knowledge of geology and cave systems gave him some confidence that they might be able to find their way to an exit, though the risks were considerable. Morrison and Professor Blackwood decided to attempt their escape through the cave system, reasoning that any chance of freedom was better than certain death at the hands of their captors. They gathered what few resources they could find in the cellar, including some tools and implements that might be useful in navigating the caves, and prepared to enter the passage that Professor Blackwood had discovered. The journey through the cave system was harrowing and dangerous, with narrow passages that required them to crawl on their hands and knees and underground streams that threatened to sweep them away. The darkness was complete, forcing them to feel their way forward and rely on Professor Blackwood's knowledge of cave formations to guide their progress. The sounds of the ritual above them gradually faded as they moved deeper into the mountain, replaced by the eerie silence of the underground world. The cave system proved to be more extensive and complex than either man had anticipated, with multiple passages branching off in different directions and chambers that seemed to have been carved by ancient underground rivers. Professor Blackwood's geological knowledge helped them navigate some of the more treacherous sections, but there were times when they were forced to make decisions based on intuition rather than scientific understanding. As they progressed through the caves, Morrison and Professor Blackwood discovered evidence that they were not the first people to use these passages as a means of escape or concealment. They found remnants of clothing, tools, and other personal belongings that suggested previous travelers had sought refuge in the cave system, though whether they had been successful in their attempts to escape remained unclear. The underground journey took them through chambers that contained formations and features that seemed almost supernatural in their beauty and strangeness. Stalactites and stalagmites had formed intricate patterns that resembled architectural structures, and underground pools reflected their flickering torchlight in ways that created an otherworldly atmosphere. Despite the beauty of their surroundings, Morrison and Professor Blackwood remained focused on their goal of finding an exit that would lead them to safety. In one particularly large chamber, they discovered what appeared to be evidence of previous human habitation, including the remains of fires, primitive tools, and symbols carved into the cave walls that were similar to those they had seen in the cellar beneath the inn. Professor Blackwood theorized that these caves might have been used by the mountain communities for centuries as places of refuge and ceremony, providing a hidden network of sites where their ancient practices could be conducted without fear of discovery. The discovery of these cave sites added another layer of complexity to Morrison and Professor Blackwood's understanding of the communities they had encountered. It suggested that the network of groups practicing ancient rituals was even more extensive and well-established than they had previously realized, with infrastructure and resources that had been developed over many generations. After what seemed like hours of difficult travel, Morrison and Professor Blackwood finally emerged from the cave system at a location several miles from the Whitaker Inn. They found themselves in a remote valley where the first light of dawn was beginning to illuminate the mountain peaks around them. Their escape had been successful, but they were now faced with the challenge of making their way to civilization and reporting what they had discovered. The journey to the nearest settlement took Morrison and Professor Blackwood several days, as they were forced to travel on foot through difficult mountain terrain while avoiding the established trails that might lead them back into the territory controlled by the Whitaker community. They survived on wild plants and stream water, their academic and religious backgrounds providing little preparation for the challenges of wilderness survival. During their journey, Morrison and Professor Blackwood encountered other travelers and mountain residents who provided additional insights into the nature of the communities they had escaped from. Some of these individuals spoke in hushed tones about families and clans that lived in the most remote areas of the mountains, groups that were said to practice ancient customs and maintain traditions that dated back to the earliest European settlements. The stories that Morrison and Professor Blackwood heard during their journey painted a picture of a complex network of isolated communities that had developed their own unique cultures and practices over generations of isolation. These communities were said to be suspicious of outsiders and protective of their traditions, using various methods to discourage investigation or interference from the outside world. One particularly disturbing account came from an elderly mountain man who claimed to have witnessed gatherings of these communities during his youth. According to his story, representatives from various families and clans would meet at specific locations during certain times of the year to conduct ceremonies and rituals that were central to their shared beliefs and traditions. These gatherings allegedly involved practices that would be considered horrifying by mainstream society, but they were viewed as sacred and necessary by the communities that participated in them. The mountain man also spoke of a hierarchy or leadership structure that existed among these communities, with certain families or individuals holding positions of authority and influence that extended across multiple groups. This leadership allegedly coordinated the activities of the various communities and ensured that their traditions and practices were maintained according to ancient customs and beliefs. Morrison and Professor Blackwood were fascinated by these accounts as they provided additional context for their own experiences at the Whitaker Inn. The stories suggested that what they had encountered was not an isolated phenomenon, but part of a larger network of communities that maintained similar practices throughout the Appalachian region. Another source of information came from a traveling preacher who had spent years ministering to remote mountain communities. The preacher spoke of encountering groups that practiced forms of Christianity that had been heavily influenced by pre-Christian traditions, creating hybrid belief systems that combined Christian theology with ancient pagan practices. These communities allegedly viewed their rituals as necessary for maintaining their relationship with God and ensuring their survival in the harsh mountain environment. The preacher also mentioned encountering communities that had rejected Christianity entirely, maintaining ancient pagan traditions that they claimed predated the arrival of European settlers in America. These groups allegedly believed that their practices connected them to the original inhabitants of the land and gave them access to spiritual powers that had been lost to the outside world. When they finally reached a town with law enforcement officials, Morrison and Professor Blackwood attempted to report what they had experienced at the Whitaker Inn. Their account was met with skepticism and disbelief, as the details of their story seemed too outrageous and disturbing for most people to accept. The remote location of the inn and the lack of physical evidence made it difficult to convince authorities to investigate their claims. The few officials who took their report seriously enough to organize an investigation found no evidence to support Morrison and Professor Blackwood's account when they visited the location of the Whitaker Inn. The building had been completely abandoned, with no sign of recent habitation or activity. The cellar that Morrison and Professor Blackwood described could not be located, and there was no evidence of the ritual activities they claimed to have witnessed. The investigation concluded that Morrison and Professor Blackwood had either fabricated their story for unknown reasons or had experienced hallucinations brought on by exposure to natural substances or psychological stress. Their reputations in their respective communities began to suffer as word spread about their wild claims and apparent mental instability. The respected minister and the distinguished professor found themselves marginalized and dismissed by colleagues who had previously held them in high regard. Despite the lack of official support for their account, Morrison and Professor Blackwood remained convinced that what they had experienced at the Whitaker Inn was real, and that the community responsible for those activities continued to pose a threat to travelers in the region. They spent years trying to gather additional evidence and find other witnesses who could corroborate their story, but their efforts were largely unsuccessful. Professor Blackwood's academic career was effectively ended by the controversy surrounding his claims about the Whitaker Inn, as his colleagues and institutions distanced themselves from what they considered to be unsubstantiated and sensational allegations. He continued his research into mountain folklore and customs as an independent scholar, but his work was no longer taken seriously by the academic establishment. Reverend Morrison faced similar challenges in his religious community, as church officials questioned his mental stability and his fitness to continue his missionary work. He was eventually reassigned to a small parish in a settled area, far from the mountain regions, where he claimed to have encountered evidence of ancient and forbidden practices. His sermons began to focus increasingly on the existence of evil in the world and the need for constant vigilance against forces that sought to corrupt and destroy human souls. The story of Morrison and Professor Blackwood's experience at the Whitaker Inn became a local legend in the mountain regions of Tennessee, passed down through generations as a cautionary tale about the dangers of venturing too far into the wilderness and the mysterious forces that were said to inhabit the remote areas of the Appalachian Mountains. Some versions of the story portrayed the two men as victims of their own imagination and paranoia, while others suggested that they had indeed encountered something supernatural and terrifying. The Whitaker Inn itself became the subject of numerous investigations and explorations by curiosity seekers and researchers who hoped to uncover evidence that might shed light on the truth behind Morrison and Professor Blackwood's claims. The site where the inn had allegedly stood was visited by countless individuals over the years, but none were able to find conclusive proof of the activities that the two men had described. Some investigators reported experiencing unusual phenomena at the site, including strange sounds, unexplained lights, and feelings of being watched or followed. These reports were generally dismissed as products of suggestion and the power of local legends, but they contributed to the site's reputation as a place where supernatural forces were active and where normal rules of reality did not apply. The legend of the Whitaker Inn continued to evolve and grow over the decades, with new details and variations being added by each generation of storytellers. Some versions of the tale described the inn as a gateway to supernatural realms, while others portrayed it as the center of a vast conspiracy involving multiple communities throughout the Appalachian region. The core elements of Morrison and Professor Blackwood's original account remained consistent across most versions, but the interpretations and explanations for what they had experienced varied widely. Modern researchers and historians have attempted to verify the historical accuracy of Morrison and Professor Blackwood's account, examining records and documents from the period to determine whether there is any factual basis for their claims. These investigations have revealed that both men were real historical figures whose backgrounds and credentials were legitimate, lending some credibility to their account despite the extraordinary nature of their claims. The research has also uncovered evidence that isolated mountain communities in the Appalachian region did indeed maintain cultural practices and traditions that differed significantly from those of mainstream society. While there is no definitive proof of the specific activities described by Morrison and Professor Blackwood, historical records suggest that some communities engaged in practices that would have been considered disturbing or illegal by the standards of the time. During their years of independent research following their escape from the Whitaker Inn, Morrison and Professor Blackwood discovered additional evidence that supported their belief that they had encountered a real and ongoing threat. They found accounts from other travelers and researchers who claimed to have experienced similar encounters with isolated mountain communities that practiced ancient and forbidden rituals. One particularly compelling account came from a federal surveyor named James Patterson, who had been mapping remote areas of the Tennessee mountains in 1861. Patterson's official reports made no mention of unusual activities, but his personal journal, discovered decades later, contained detailed descriptions of encounters with communities that engaged in practices similar to those witnessed by Morrison and Professor Blackwood. According to Patterson's journal, he had stumbled upon a gathering of mountain families who were conducting what he described as a ritual involving the sacrifice of captured travelers. Patterson had managed to escape detection and had observed the ceremony from a hidden position, but the experience had left him deeply traumatized and convinced that such activities were more widespread than anyone in the outside world suspected. Patterson's journal also contained references to other locations where similar activities were allegedly taking place, including detailed descriptions of sites and landmarks that could be used to identify specific areas. Morrison and Professor Blackwood used this information to guide their own investigations, visiting some of the locations mentioned in Patterson's account and finding evidence that supported his claims. Another significant piece of evidence came from the records of a traveling physician named Dr. Marcus Thornfield, who had practiced medicine in the mountain regions during the 1850s and 1860s. Dr. Thornfield's medical journals contained numerous references to patients who had suffered injuries that were inconsistent with normal accidents or illnesses, suggesting that they had been victims of deliberate violence or ritual activities. Dr. Thornfield had also documented cases of entire families who had disappeared from their homes without explanation, leaving behind all their possessions and showing no signs of having planned to relocate. The physician had suspected that these disappearances were connected to the activities of secret communities that operated in the most remote areas of the mountains, but he had been unable to gather sufficient evidence to prove his theories. The accumulation of evidence from multiple sources convinced Morrison and Professor Blackwood that the Whitaker Inn was not an isolated phenomenon, but part of a larger network of communities that maintained ancient traditions and practices throughout the Appalachian region. They began to develop theories about the origins and extent of these communities, drawing on historical records and folklore to piece together a comprehensive picture of what they believed was a hidden aspect of American history. According to their research, the communities that practiced these ancient rituals were descendants of early European settlers who had brought pre-Christian traditions with them to America. These traditions had been preserved and evolved in isolation, developing into forms that bore little resemblance to their original sources, but maintained their essential character as systems of belief and practice that existed outside mainstream society. The geographic isolation of the Appalachian Mountains had provided ideal conditions for these communities to maintain their traditions without interference from outside authorities. The difficult terrain and limited access routes made it possible for entire communities to exist virtually undetected, developing their own cultures and practices while remaining hidden from the view of the outside world. Morrison and Professor Blackwood's research suggested that these communities had developed sophisticated methods for identifying and capturing suitable victims for their rituals, using a network of informants and collaborators to monitor the movements of travelers and identify potential targets. The Whitaker Inn represented just one example of the infrastructure that these communities had developed to support their activities. The two men also discovered evidence that suggested these communities maintained contact with each other, sharing information and resources while coordinating their activities to avoid detection by authorities. This network of communication and cooperation allowed them to operate on a much larger scale than would have been possible for isolated individual communities. As Morrison and Professor Blackwood continued their research, they began to attract the attention of individuals and organizations who were interested in their findings for various reasons. Some were fellow researchers and academics who were intrigued by the historical and anthropological implications of their discoveries, while others appeared to have more sinister motivations. The two men began to receive threatening messages and warnings to cease their investigations, suggesting that their research had touched on subjects that certain parties preferred to keep hidden. They also noticed that they were being followed and observed, indicating that their activities were being monitored by unknown individuals who had the resources and motivation to conduct sophisticated surveillance operations. These developments convinced Morrison and Professor Blackwood that their research had uncovered something far more significant and dangerous than they had initially realized. The fact that their investigations were attracting such intense interest from unknown parties suggested that the communities they were studying continued to exist and operate, and that they had the ability to protect themselves from exposure through intimidation and possibly more direct means. Despite the risks involved, Morrison and Professor Blackwood continued their research, driven by a sense of moral obligation to expose what they believed was an ongoing threat to innocent travelers and isolated communities. They took elaborate precautions to protect themselves and their research materials, but they were aware that their efforts might not be sufficient to ensure their safety. The pressure and stress of living under constant threat took a severe toll on both men's physical and mental health. Morrison developed chronic insomnia and anxiety, while Professor Blackwood began to show signs of paranoia and depression. Their research became an obsession that consumed their lives, leaving them isolated from normal human relationships and activities. Morrison and Professor Blackwood also discovered that their research had attracted the attention of government agencies that were interested in their findings for reasons that remained unclear. They received visits from individuals who claimed to represent various federal departments and agencies, but whose true identities and motivations remained mysterious. These officials asked detailed questions about their research and seemed particularly interested in the locations and methods used by the communities they had studied. The government interest in their research added another layer of complexity and danger to Morrison and Professor Blackwood's situation. They were unsure whether these officials represented legitimate law enforcement efforts or whether they had other motivations for wanting to suppress or control the information that the two men had gathered. The mysterious government agents seemed to possess detailed knowledge about the mountain communities that Morrison and Professor Blackwood had been studying, suggesting that official agencies had been aware of these groups for some time. The agents asked specific questions about ritual practices, community hierarchies, and communication networks that indicated they had access to information that went far beyond what Morrison and Professor Blackwood had been able to discover through their own investigations. These encounters with government representatives raised disturbing questions about the extent to which official agencies might be involved with or complicit in the activities of the mountain communities. Morrison and Professor Blackwood began to suspect that their research had uncovered not just a network of isolated communities practicing ancient rituals, but a conspiracy that might extend into the highest levels of government and society. In 1867, Professor Blackwood disappeared while conducting research in a remote area of the Kentucky mountains. His body was never found, and the circumstances of his disappearance remained a mystery, despite extensive searches by local authorities and volunteers. Morrison was convinced that his colleague had been eliminated by the same forces that had been threatening their research, but he was unable to prove his suspicions. Morrison continued his investigations alone for several more years, but the loss of his collaborator and the increasing pressure from unknown adversaries gradually wore down his resolve. He began to suffer from periods of confusion and disorientation that made it difficult for him to continue his work effectively, and his physical health deteriorated rapidly. During his final years of research, Morrison made several disturbing discoveries that suggested the network of mountain communities was far more extensive and organized than he had previously realized. He found evidence of communication systems that allowed these communities to coordinate their activities across vast distances, and he discovered references to a central authority or leadership structure that provided guidance and direction to the various local groups. Morrison's final research notes, discovered after his death, contained references to what he described as a great gathering that was scheduled to take place in the mountains of eastern Tennessee in the autumn of 1871. According to his notes, this gathering would bring together representatives from communities throughout the Appalachian region for a ceremony of unprecedented significance and scope. The notes also contained Morrison's theories about the ultimate purpose and goals of the network of communities he had been studying. He believed that these groups were working towards some form of transformation or awakening that would fundamentally change the nature of human society, using their ancient rituals and practices to prepare for an event that they considered to be of cosmic significance. Morrison's research had led him to believe that the mountain communities were part of a much larger movement that extended far beyond the Appalachian region, with connections to similar groups in other parts of the United States and possibly in other countries. He theorized that these communities were working together to preserve and practice ancient traditions that they believed would eventually be revealed to the world as humanity entered a new phase of spiritual and cultural development. In 1871, Morrison was found dead in his small cabin in the mountains of eastern Tennessee, apparently having succumbed to a combination of illness and exhaustion. His research materials were missing from the cabin, and there were signs that the building had been searched thoroughly by unknown individuals. The official cause of death was listed as natural causes, but those familiar with Morrison's work suspected that he had been silenced to prevent him from revealing what he had discovered. The deaths of Morrison and Professor Blackwood effectively ended the most comprehensive investigation into the activities of the secret mountain communities that had been conducted up to that time. Their research materials were never recovered, and the knowledge they had accumulated about the network of communities and their practices was lost with them. However, the legend of the Whitaker Inn and the research conducted by Morrison and Professor Blackwood continued to inspire others to investigate similar phenomena. Over the years, numerous researchers, journalists, and curiosity seekers attempted to uncover evidence of the secret communities that the two men had claimed to have discovered. Some of these investigations yielded intriguing results, including the discovery of abandoned settlements and ritual sites that seemed to support some aspects of Morrison and Professor Blackwood's theories. However, none of the subsequent researchers were able to gather the comprehensive evidence that would have been necessary to prove the existence of the network of communities that the two men had described. The question of whether the Whitaker Inn and the community that allegedly operated it actually existed remains a subject of debate among historians and researchers. The lack of physical evidence and the extraordinary nature of the claims make it difficult to reach definitive conclusions, but the consistency and detail of Morrison and Professor Blackwood's account suggest that they experienced something that profoundly affected their lives and worldview. The legacy of the Whitaker Inn story continues to influence discussions about the nature of evil, the limits of human behavior, and the existence of hidden communities that operate according to different moral and ethical standards than those accepted by mainstream society. The tale serves as a reminder that there may be aspects of human nature and human history that remain hidden from view, existing in the margins and shadows of our civilized world. The story also raises important questions about the relationship between folklore and reality, and the ways in which extraordinary claims are evaluated and accepted or rejected by society. Morrison and Professor Blackwood's experience illustrates the challenges faced by individuals who claim to have encountered phenomena that exist outside the bounds of normal experience and the personal costs that can result from speaking about such encounters. The Whitaker Inn remains one of the most compelling and disturbing legends in American folklore, a story that combines elements of historical fact with supernatural horror to create a narrative that continues to fascinate and terrify those who encounter it. Whether the events described by Morrison and Professor Blackwood actually occurred or were products of their imagination, the story serves as a powerful reminder of the darkness that may lurk beneath the surface of even the most welcoming and hospitable environments. The inn, where strangers were served as offerings rather than meals, stands as a symbol of the hidden dangers that may await those who venture too far from the safety of civilization, and the terrible prices that may be paid by those who stumble upon secrets that were meant to remain buried in the remote places of the world. The legacy of the Whitaker clan and their alleged practices continues to echo through the mountains of Tennessee, a whispered warning that some hospitality comes at a cost too terrible to imagine. In the end, the story of the Whitaker Inn serves as a testament to the power of human imagination to create narratives that capture our deepest fears and anxieties about the unknown. Whether rooted in historical fact or born from the collective unconscious of a society grappling with the darkness that exists within human nature, the tale continues to resonate with those who hear it, reminding us that there are some mysteries that may be too dangerous to solve and some truths that may be too terrible to face. The mountains of Tennessee still hold their secrets, and the valleys where the Whitaker Inn once stood continue to whisper of things that should not be spoken aloud. The legacy of that terrible place lives on in the stories told around campfires and in the warnings passed down from generation to generation, serving as a reminder that there are some places where the darkness is too deep and some knowledge too dangerous for mortal minds to comprehend. The tale of the Whitaker Inn serves as a bridge between the known and unknown, the civilized and the savage, the sacred and the profane. It reminds us that beneath the veneer of civilization and hospitality, there may lurk ancient hungers and primitive needs that civilization has not entirely succeeded in suppressing. The story challenges us to consider what we would do if confronted with evidence of such darkness, and whether we would have the courage to speak the truth, even if no one would believe us. The Whitaker clan may be gone, but their legacy lives on in the collective memory of those who refuse to forget that evil can wear a welcoming face and that the most dangerous predators are often those who appear most harmless. The inn where strangers were served as offerings rather than meals remains a powerful symbol of the hidden dangers that may await the unwary traveler, and a reminder that some doors should never be opened, some invitations should never be accepted, and some hospitality should never be trusted. The story continues to evolve and adapt to new generations of listeners, each finding in it reflections of their own fears and anxieties about the unknown dangers that may lurk in the world around them. The Whitaker Inn has become more than just a historical curiosity or a local legend. It has become a symbol of the eternal struggle between civilization and savagery, between the light of human knowledge and the darkness of human nature. In our modern world, where technology has made the remote corners of the earth more accessible, and where scientific understanding has explained many of the mysteries that once terrified our ancestors, the story of the Whitaker Inn serves as a reminder that there may still be places where ancient evils persist and where the normal rules of civilization do not apply. It challenges us to remain vigilant and to remember that the price of safety and security is eternal watchfulness against the forces that would drag us back into the darkness from which we have emerged. The Whitaker Inn stands as a monument to the power of human evil and the depths to which some individuals and communities may sink when freed from the constraints of civilized society. It serves as a warning that the veneer of civilization is thin and fragile, and that beneath the surface of even the most welcoming and hospitable environments may lurk dangers that exceed our worst nightmares. The legacy of Morrison and Professor Blackwood's investigation continues to inspire those who seek to understand the darker aspects of human nature and the hidden corners of human history. Their courage in speaking about what they had witnessed, despite the personal costs and the skepticism of others, serves as an example of the importance of bearing witness to truth, even when that truth is too terrible for most people to accept. The story of the Whitaker Inn will continue to be told and retold, each generation finding in it new meanings and interpretations that reflect their own understanding of the world and their own fears about the unknown. It remains a powerful reminder that there are some mysteries that may never be fully solved, and some truths that may be too dangerous for human minds to comprehend, but that must nevertheless be remembered and passed down as warnings to future generations. The inn where strangers were served as offerings rather than meals will forever remain a dark chapter in the hidden history of America, a reminder that even in the land of the free and the home of the brave, there have always been those who chose to embrace the darkness rather than the light, and who were willing to sacrifice the innocent in pursuit of their own twisted beliefs and desires.